Good evening, everybody. I have to admit, I was tempted to make some joke about how an academy, a league, and a federation walked into a bar. It feels like the opening of a really, really bad joke. But I will say that between these three institutions, we have, if I've calculated correctly, over 400 years of experience in American art. So this panel better be the best panel that you've ever seen in your lives. I'm Russell Lord. I'm the Director of Exhibitions and Curatorial Initiatives at the AFA, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for this program at the Art Students League here in New York and also online. This special program ties to our exhibition, Making American Artists, Stories from the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, 1776 to 1976, which features over 100 acclaimed and recognizable works. I've sort of likened it to opening an art history textbook of American art, and yet in a more progressive way. And we have this lovely book that accompanies the exhibition. The exhibition will first open at the Wichita Art Museum this January, and then travels to a number of other venues, 5 more across the US. We're delighted that it's getting such exposure in places that I think really are excited to see this history of American art. And I'm looking forward to the insights of our panelists tonight, Jonathan Katz, Anna Marley, and Ksenia Soboleva. So thank you to them. Before I turn the evening over to Anna, I'd just like to thank those who have championed the AFA and this public program in particular. My thanks to Michael, Esther, and Ksenia here at the Art Students League of New York. I'd like to thank the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the Office of the Governor and the New York State Legislature, the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, and the American Chai Trust. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and I'll turn the program over to Anna.
Thank you, Russell, and thank you all for coming tonight. It's so great to see some new faces and some old friends. One of my friends from Montreal is here, who I've known since I was 12 years old, so that's pretty exciting. As well as some of our supporters from the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And those of you who may have never been to PAFA may not know that we were founded in 1805, which makes us the first art museum and art school in the United States. So we have a lot of stories, plural, to tell. And so we have my brilliant colleagues' bios up on the screen. Hopefully you also read about them before you came, so I'm not going to talk at length about them. I'm going to have them talk about themselves. What we wanted to start with is the question, why are we here in this room? Obviously, AFA is excited to kick off the tour of Making American Artists, as well as finally getting the catalog, which Jonathan wrote for. So if you like what you hear tonight, please buy the catalog. I was talking to a friend of PAFA today as we were walking around New York looking at art, and he said, you know, Anna, how did you come up with this theme of queer identities and histories of American art? Because you're such a scholar of queer art. And he was being sarcastic. He is a former dealer who is a major collector of queer art. So I want to acknowledge that this theme developed out of the art and out of the stories in this exhibition, and also out of a previous exhibition. So a number of years ago during the pandemic, I was working on a show called Women in Motion. And it was about 150 years of women artists at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. And I called Jonathan, who I had known for a number of years, and I said, okay, Jonathan, there are these amazing women artists from the 19th century who today would identify as queer or lesbian, but there was no language for that in the 19th century. So how are we going to talk about this in the show without outing these women, many of whom still have connections in the community and in Philadelphia. So, for example, Violet Oakley and Edith Emerson, who were very involved at PAFA, and Jonathan was great, and we sat down and we talked a lot about that. I was also really influenced by the National Park Service, who did a great guide for when they were working on celebrating anniversary of Stonewall, about some language. So that exhibition really got me thinking about, particularly at PAFA, a history of lesbian artists. But then when I was putting together this exhibition, Making American Artists, we wanted to very much dispense with chronology and focus on some of the stories that had not been celebrated at PAFA, and that had always been there. And this was really inspired for me by one of my students at PAFA, who is trans, and took a class that I taught on American women artists, and they were weeping because they really had never learned about this history of lesbian artists in the 19th century, and they felt like their past was made present in the exhibition, in the collection. And I thought, okay, well, we need to do that for this tour that's going to go around the country. And so at that point, I reached out to Jonathan and asked him to write for the publication, and he'll talk a little bit about that. And then as we were putting together this panel, my dear friend Clarity Haynes, who is a great artist, recommended Ksenia as an amazing scholar, and I'm so honored to have met you, and looking forward to learning from you tonight. And I'm just so thrilled that this exhibition is going around the country, and that Barclay Hendricks is on the cover of the catalog, and that everybody who comes to see this exhibition is going to be thinking about queer identities and histories of American art in Kansas and Albuquerque, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in North Carolina, in Virginia. It's really exciting. And so it's great that we're starting off this conversation in New York. So there you go. I'm the chief of curatorial affairs at PAFA, and that's why I'm in the room. I've been at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts for 14 years now, and I am interested in nothing less than changing the canon and changing the discussions about American art. So that's why I'm here. So why don't I start with you, Ksenia? Why are you here in the room tonight?
Thank you, Anna, and thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone for being here tonight, and not at the Juju Chicago opening at the new museum. I'm very flattered. First, I just want to take a moment to also acknowledge the heaviness of the past few days. And I will say that something that I have always valued about queerness is that it's not just a sexual identity, it's a political one. And queer people are forced at a very young age, to think about the world and the politics that rule it in a critical way, because we feel rejected and we feel displaced. And in order to envision a world that we want to be a part of, we have to identify the power structures that repress us. So that's one. And then why am I here? Can you still hear me? So I, for the last decade, which is how long I've lived in New York, have been invested in queer art and culture, more specifically lesbian identity and lesbian visibility in art history. I did my PhD at the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, and I wrote a dissertation on art and lesbian identity during the AIDS crisis. And since then, I've continued to write about lesbian identity. And one of my favorite things to say is that lesbian comes in many genders. The proliferation of queer has really gotten most of the credit for expanding the gender spectrum, but I would argue that lesbian identity already held much space for gender play, BDSM culture, promiscuity, non-monogamy, safe-sex education. And during the AIDS crisis, actually a lot of scholars turned to lesbian writings of the sex wars as a source of information and inspiration. So I would argue that lesbian was already queer. And that is not to say that there are no TERFs and whatever the gay male equivalent of that is. But I guess I want to hold on to the promise of the word lesbian. And I'm sort of paraphrasing Sarah Ahmed here, who in her publication, Living a Feminist Life, said that she wants to hold on to the term feminist, right? So to the promise of the term feminist. So I'm interested in how lesbian identity coexists alongside other queer identities, because I think it's a common misconception that these are mutually exclusive, and in fact they can all coexist. And that's why I'm here. Thank you for having me.
I guess I'm here because I do a lot of queer exhibitions and a lot of queer writing. I wrote the second dissertation in the field of art history on queer topic, and give you a sense of what it was like in those days. I was kicked out of 4 graduate schools before I was able to finally finish. And that was kind of amazing to my friends that I could, in fact, finish doing a queer topic. I wrote on Jasper Johns' relationship with Robert Rauschenberg and their interpictorial communication across some of the most famous paintings in American art. And finally ended up doing that at Northwestern University, having been kicked out of Yale, University of Chicago, and Johns Hopkins. Some of the, I've always been able to say I've been kicked out of the best universities in America. And so it's been very difficult, but I did an exhibition called Hide and Seek at the Smithsonian that was the first sort of major museum queer exhibition, and then a show called Art Aids America, and then I used to work for something called the Leslie Lohman Museum as its chief curator, and now I do a lot of work for a museum in Chicago called Wrightwood, which is doing a lot of really wonderful, big budget, beautiful queer exhibitions. So if you haven't been to Wrightwood 659 in Chicago, make a point of doing so. It's really an amazing place.
Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so the first question that I'm going to ask about both of you tonight is, what is queer American art history?
Shall I go first?
Sure.
Okay, so I think that there are 2 queer art histories, right? There are 2 ways of interpreting that question. There is queer art history, and there is a queer way of practicing art history, right? And I'm invested in both, and sort of a bilateral employment of both. So on the one hand, I am interested in artists that have recorded, reflected, created, preserved queer culture, and the many things that can mean, as well as artists whose work today speaks to queer culture in a way that we wouldn't have considered then. I think there is, it's hard not to see the slides, but like there's Edward Higgs.
Yes.
If you can go to the slide with the animals. I look at that painting, and even though, he made it, it was about, oh my God, what is the Shakers?
He is a Quaker.
Quakers. I'm not American. So it was very much about Quaker religion and sort of inner life. But I look at that painting that may or may not appear, and I think of for example, Jack Halberstam's writing on queer wildness and this idea of wildness as a different epistemology for queerness, right? To speak to these unruly ways that queer people can exist in the world, and that's something that Derrida already hinted at in The Beast and the Sovereign. He said that there are two groups that fall outside of society. The sovereign stands above it and the beast falls below it. So there are ways in which queer people have been outcasts and considered uncivilized and therefore wild in the same way as animals. And I love also thinking about Rosa Bonheur and, you know, her painting all the animals, and she was a lesbian. And there's a text in which her father is talking about her, and he says, I don't know why Rosa had to paint all these queer animals. And of course he didn't mean queer in the sense that we understand it today, but I actually would say that we should think about it in those terms. Plus that oftentimes artists and writers would refer to or would represent or write about animals in lieu of queer loves that they couldn't speak about.
There it is.
Oh, here we are.
Yeah.
Yes. So wonderful, wonderful painting. And then the queer way of practicing art history, right? What does it mean to challenge this idea of history itself, right? There is no definitive queer art history because the whole point is that we fall in between the cracks and we're elusive. And our histories have been repressed and erased. And it's also, there are many histories and they're not linear. Mm-hmm. So what would it mean to challenge the field of art history itself? And there's actually a wonderful essay from the 90s by Whitney Davis where he says that art history itself as a field is in the closet because it doesn't honestly engage with its own queerness. So I always assign that to my students.
And can I just say something about this painting, since, you know, you talking about, you know, that it is this biblical proverb about the lion lying down with the lamb, you know, this idea of these things that are not supposed to be together, being together. And then, of course, what he's doing with this Quaker painting in this parable is he's taking another PAFA painting, Benjamin West's Penn's Treaty with the Indians, and that is happening in the background. So, which is this, you know, foundational myth about Pennsylvania as this peaceful, fair land of exchange, completely ignoring the walking purchase and the theft of Lenape land. So I think I haven't thought about this through your lens, but I love what you're saying and thinking about how could we examine this through a queer methodology. So thank you for that.
So one of the things that's always struck me is that I teach a course on queer American art at Penn, and it is utterly coterminous with the Intro to American Art that's also taught. But the Intro to American Art doesn't really talk about sexuality, and of course mine does. And the centrality of queer artists to not only the American art world, but certainly to the American art world is one of the things that I've been working towards my entire life. But one of the striking things is how rare it is to encounter somebody like Anna who's actually interested in this topic and willing to see it happen. So very often, institutions, and you know the institutions I'm talking about, don't address questions of sexuality or have only recently begun to do this. But I also want to say, and this is a kind of mea culpa, that when I started out, like so many of us in the late 70s, early 80s, I understood that this was a question of a lack of representation of gay, lesbian, bi, and trans. And the way I understood this was that there were, a majority of people who were heterosexual, and there was a minority of people who were sexually different, and they had been repressed. What I have come to since understand is that that binary structure is itself an historical development that had a heyday of about 50 years. And so when we talk about a queer art history, what we're really talking about is an art history that actually goes back before gay and lesbian, and now is picking it up again, which is to say a non-binary sense of sexuality. I can show you shungas, books of drawings in Japan from the 1850s about the education of, erotic education of a young man, in which literally he's sleeping with women, he's bottoming to men, he's sleeping with women, he's bottoming to men, and this was normative in Japan in the 1850s. We, with the arrogance of the present, assume that our structure of sexuality is unproblematically extended back into the past. But in fact, it's a very different world. And so part of what a queer art history does is look in specific ways at how, right, sexual difference operated socially, politically at the period. And just real quick, we're looking at Homer here. The more you look at Homer, the more you see two kinds of things going on. Can we go back, or is that not a possibility?
Which one do you want, Jonathan?
If we could go back 3 pictures. There we go, that one. So notice in Homer, it's always single sex. They're women together, or they're men together, but there are almost no pictures of women and men in normative discourse. This is a picture, and you'll see this repeatedly, with African Americans eroticized. And in his letters, he also talks about how free he feels in the Bahamas. But always that New England superego, right? So he surrounds the object of desire, right, with an overdetermined cast of dangers. It's not just sharks, but the mast is broken, the waves are bad, right? On and on and on. He's punishing himself for his desires, right? And in all of his work, you can either see this sort of New England reticence or this sort of repressed eroticism, especially when he goes south.
And there's animals in this one too.
Yes, animals. Yes.
I will just add, I would really recommend this book by Helen MacDonald, H is for Hawk, in which she writes about T.H. White and how he was closeted and how his trying to tame this hawk was like trying to tame his queer desire. Have you read that? So good.
Well, and something that in the catalog, both Jonathan and another author, Dana Bird, talk about is this particular Homer painting was exhibited. So this is in the Met's collection, and they just did a show about this last year that some of you may have seen. I know I did. And we lent our amazing painting, The Fox Hunt, which is in our show. To that. But this painting was shown at PAFA the year it was painted, the same year that Henry Tanner's Nicodemus painting was painted. And in Dana's essay, she talks about blackness and why Henry Tanner's Nicodemus with blackness was acceptable to Philadelphia audiences and why this was not. I mean, this painting was ravaged by the critics, right?
Right.
And I think if you followed some of the arguments that Jonathan is making, I think that the critics were very uncomfortable with this painting. And it wasn't necessarily because it depicted a black man. No. Because it was in the same show with Henry Tanner, who was a black man, painting Jesus as a black man. Or at least a man from the Middle East,
yeah,
a man of color. So, yeah.
It's a male odalisque.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, my next question is, and we've gotten to this a little bit, is how do you talk about queerness before there is a language to discuss it. And it's so interesting, Ksenia, that you mentioned the word queer and how it was applied to, was it to Rosa Bonheur and her animals?
Yeah.
Because one of the works that you'll see rotating through here is a work by Anna Elizabeth Klumpke, which I don't know if you've seen that one. It's massive. It's over life size. It's a scene of washerwomen. It's this homosocial space of just women, and Anna Elizabeth Klumpke was Rosa Bonheur's lover. So she was an American artist. She was enamored of Rosa Bonheur, and she moved to Paris, and then they lived together until Rosa died. She was much younger than her, but that is one of the first. That was the first painting by a woman to ever receive the Temple Gold Medal at PAFA, and it's been in our collection since the 1890s. This one here, this amazing, huge painting, which only shows women working together in a very different way from a male, I think, who would be painting peasant scenes, which were very popular at the French Salon at that time. This is so unique and so fantastic and so huge. But that language of queer was also applied to Harriet Hosmer when she was working in Rome. And that was the sculpture we used for the poster for this show, the puck on a toadstool. And that was a work that I purchased for PAFA. It's the oldest sculpture it was the oldest sculpture by a woman artist until I got a waxwork by Patience Wright. But this work here.
Can we hold on this?
Yeah, let's hold on this one. And so, the language of queerness was actually used to describe Harriet Hosmer in Rome in the time. And of course, it wasn't used the way we use it today. But I wonder if you could both talk about that, about this language of queerness and how to talk about artists like Harriet Hosmer, who we know was in long-term relationships with women, romantic relationships in her time, but she never would have said, I'm queer or I am a lesbian.
Exactly.
So I would say, I would actually say that we always had the language and we still don't have the language. I think that language is slippery and it constantly fails us, and that's why I'm a writer, because I love that language fails. Just a fun fact, Catherine Lord has written about this, but the first time that the word queer was used in reference to sexual identity was by Ann Lister. You might know the show Gentleman Jack, and it was as a code word for vagina. But there is a tendency these days, especially, to rush to add language in order to accommodate this large scope of identities that are emerging, right? And I am actually more interested in thinking about how can we take the existing language, such as the term lesbian, and expand it and make it elastic and make the existing language hold more, right? There's no way of knowing whether somebody like Claude Cahun today would have identified as non-binary or trans. But I think that I don't think that they would mind being considered as part of this narrative. And in that, I would insist on the importance of the scholars writing about queer artists being queer themselves, because I actually truly believe that we have intergenerational connection. I think that queers can speak to ghosts. So I think that if it feels right to engage in a historical queer artist in a particular way, then that is a critical authority that we might engage in.
I think that's a great exhibition title or book title. Queers Can Speak to Ghosts. Yeah.
So the fascinating thing about Hosmer was that she was continuously addressed in the popular press in masculinist terms. Her biceps were noted, her male dress was noted. So there was no ambiguity about her sort of masculinist presentation. And what makes this, which was actually her most popular sculpture of everything she did, what makes this queer, again, before we have a language to describe it, is that she's taken self-consciously the figure of Puck. Now, we think of Puck as male because of Shakespeare, but if you go back to the original English usage, the figure of Puck is a kitchen sprite that is non-binary, neither male nor female. And it is a jealous sprite. You have to basically bribe Puck, or your cake's going to fall. And so what she's done is she gives us what looks at first to be a kind of Cupid figure, but the more you look at it, you realize, oh, damn, those are bat wings, not angel's wings. And that figure is throwing a bug at us. Do you see it? Right? And it's sitting on a toadstool. And you come to realize that though this looks kind of peaceful, there's a real aggression here, a real refusal of social norms. And so what I want to say here is that what makes this thing queer is that it takes the assumptions we make and quietly does the work to undercut it.
All right, I have one more question for each one of you, and then I think we'll open it up to questions from the audience. I think I'll start with you, Ksenia. You've discussed queer abstraction in the context of works of 19th and 20th century American art. Can you elaborate on this theoretical framework for looking at abstraction and/or landscape through this lens?
Can we go to an abstract work? Not this one, next one, to the Sonia Sekula maybe. Or Marcin Hartley actually is
This is good.
It's good too for now, and then we'll go to Sonia after. But this is a good example of how abstraction can be used to represent queerness in coded ways, right? So Marcin Hartley painting his lover through abstraction. But then there's also something about abstraction that provides more open-endedness and a potential to project one's identity. And this is something that David Getzi has written about at length. Because, once a body is represented in the traditional sense of the word, we rush to classify it. Mm-hmm. So in a way, when you have an abstract work of art, it speaks more to queer being rather than, yes, let's leave it here. It speaks more to queer being than queer appearance, right? And even though I love queer figurative painting, I have to say that some of my most profound experiences with queer art have been abstract artists such as Agnes Martin, Louise Fishman, Sonia Sekula. And there is, I often think to myself, would I like this work by Louise Fishman if it wasn't painted by Louise Fishman? And I might not, because my investment would be different. Because I always think about the person, the body that made the work, and the life that body led. And it's interesting to put these two together in particular, because, both Sekula and Fishman were openly out lesbians during their time, but Sekula was an earlier generation than Fishman, and Sekula was always made to feel mentally ill. And when you are made to feel mentally ill because of your sexual identity, you actually can become mentally ill. So Sekula ended up committing suicide in the early 60s. And then there's someone like Fishman, who was openly out and was part of the gay liberation movement, part of Heresies, which was a feminist feminist magazine, and there is a piece that she wrote in Heresies that I really love, where it's like her advice on how to be a painter, and she says, right, that lesbian painters shouldn't limit their references to lesbian artists. She's like, take what you want from Matisse, Gauguin, you know, and that's sort of my point with the Hicks too. I think as queer scholars and, you know, practicing queer art history, we should take what we want if it suits our needs to this queer narrative that we're trying to convey. And then the other thing that I did want to touch upon briefly is if we can go back to you know, the landscape and then the painting next to it. So I had never seen that painting by Maria Sloan. Exactly.
Mariana Sloan. Yeah.
Mariana Sloan. I never seen it, and then I saw it in the catalog, and right away I thought of my very dear friend Samantha Nye, who is an artist based in Philadelphia. So I thought, great, you know, she's based in Philadelphia, I can make this comparison. And there is a way in which, to me, landscape exists in a realm of abstraction and goes through these transitions, you know, weather, mood, depending on the time of day. I always think about Virginia Woolf, and particularly Orlando, and when she writes about Orlando's gender transition, she actually talks about nature and the weather instead of the body. So there's something about landscape that is really queer to me. And then, of course, those who inhabit the landscapes. And what I loved about this Mariana Sloan is that the people are very ambiguous, right? They're abstracted. And then there is the Samantha Nye. And what Nye does is she takes Slim Aaron's photographs. Many of you might be familiar with those, where it's he once referred to his photographs as attractive people doing attractive things in attractive places, and it's primarily, you know, white, privileged, wealthy people hanging out by poolsides. And so what she does is she takes away those people and she queers that landscape, and she replaces it with lesbian elders, both cisgender and non-binary and trans. And so it becomes this lesbian utopia that really exposes that misogyny and homophobia and ageism are all interconnected. And so I encourage everyone to look into her work.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Jonathan another question, but some of the things you said, I love both the Mariana Sloan and the Sonia Sekula. Mariana Sloan was the sister of John Sloan, who most people who follow American art might have heard of, but Mariana was just as talented, if not more, but is less known today. And Sonia Sekula, that painting was gifted to us by her former gallerist, Betty Parsons, and it was never in a frame until we worked on this exhibition. And I couldn't afford to frame it, but I was not willing to keep her in the closet or the vaults for this show. I knew how important it was, so I do want to give a shout out to Gil and Lagodich Fine Arts, who basically donated the labor to make the frame for that painting, and then also a frame for Ed Loper, who was a Black artist. So just thinking as a curator, you might not see a lot of this art because many of these artists, including Black artists and queer artists or lesbian artists, would not have had the money to frame their art at the high level of some of their peers. So, you know, unless somebody pays for it, unless somebody pays to frame it, it's not going to get shown. So that's another important thing about doing these deep dives into collections and investing in these artists. And for me, not having known much about Sonia Sekula being trained as an 18th and 19th century scholar and just falling in love with her and falling in love with her story and realizing, hey, we need a frame for that, just like we have a frame for our Marston Hartley or for our, Stellas. So, Jonathan, this is a big question, and I know you've written books about it, but what is homosexual art before homosexuality?
Well, in many respects, what we need to sort of think about here is how our definitions don't do a kind of violence on history by assuming that our categories can be unproblematically thrown back. And I want to say that in this respect, we queer art historians are remarkably sensitive to history in a way that, forgive me, but a lot of straight historians are not. Because they unproblematically use the word marriage to describe a coupling in the 5th century, in the 12th century, and in the 18th century, and they're completely different social meanings for each of those formations. And so we're really scrupulous about saying, we have to understand what the context is. So let's just stop here for a second. And I'm just picking this up, but here we have John Singer Sargent doing an odalisque, and the pose intended to essentially reveal the secondary sexual characteristics of a woman, but in this instance with his male servant. So we see him, deliberately sort of quoting a female pose for a man. Can we go to the next one? And here, Thomas McKellar, his model for almost all of his sort of great works, an elevator operator in a hotel in Boston, and this picture accompanied him to all of his studios. It was his great joy. And can we see the next one? And here, you have an image of a men's bath by a straight artist who, there's no question that Bellows was interested in women, but Bellows was very much as an ashcan school painter. That was what he was called. And he was called that because it was like looking into the ashcan, looking at the dirtiness of society. And so he was interested in the social marginals, including queers, as well as women, as well as African Americans, as well as immigrants, and the poor. And what he does here is give us a homoerotic relationship front and center. Look at this painting, and what you will see is the figure on the left is totally the very stereotype of a queer, or rather the figure on the right, because I'm doing the other way around. I should know this, I'm an art historian. He's got the mustache, he's got his hands on his hip, he's got the leering grin, he's got a concatenation of all the different sort of queer tropes. And the figure on the right is like a totally normative guy, except look carefully, and I think we can all agree that the normative guy's towel is curiously starched, if you get my drift. And so, front and center, we have a homoerotic relationship in a print. Now, if this was a painting goes into the collection of one collector. That's okay. You can target somebody. But not only was this a print, but it was one of his most successful prints that went through 3 different states. And so, I would challenge you to find a queer-themed image today that would go through, 3 different printings. And what he's doing, he's basically telling us that this is what happens in shower baths. This was, of course, in the period before modern plumbing, and you would go once or twice a week to the public baths. And of course, you would see homoerotic activity in them. But he's also telling us something specific about the social world then. Because according to the normative understandings of the time, the guy on the right is queer. But the guy on the left is trade. That's not queer. In fact, you could have sex exclusively with men, and you would not be queer because if you operated according to the dictate of your gender, in other words, if you didn't contravene your gender in the sexual act, you were straight. And so what this tells us is a completely different social world. One of the questions I used to ask is, why is all the apparatus of gay life, lesbian life, so modern? Why didn't they do it earlier? They didn't do it earlier because they didn't need or want to do it earlier. Queers needed straights, and straights needed queers in order to do that which made you queer in the first place, right? But of course, with the development of the modern model of gay and lesbian, we created, as it were, single-sex neighborhoods, right? Which is to say, queer neighborhoods. And so what's striking about this is that it tells us that once upon a time, a straight man could paint a painting of what everybody saw happening and acknowledge that queer and straight lived together, knew one another, were intimate in a way that fell apart. And now, I think, is finally coming back.
Can I add something? I do think that the reason that this was able to become so popular is because there was otherwise no question that George Bellows was straight, especially beyond sexual identity. He was certainly not queer. You know, he did not live life in a queer way, whereas somebody like Paul Cadmus got a lot of shit for that.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so yes, it was there, but when straight people were doing
And
it.
if you take a look at this, what you see, this is a 6-foot wide painting. It's a public painting. And if you look carefully, it's a scene of the East River and the working class youths bathing, and everybody belongs. But look carefully. Do you see him? He's there just to watch. Right? So Bellows had a paradoxical freedom to represent queer life in a way that queer artists of the period, which is to say homosexual artists of the period, were not able to do.
So I see people lurking in the background. It's 7 o'clock, and we want to make sure that you can ask any questions that you might want to have. We are being live streamed. We have a microphone over here. So if you would like to ask a question of any of us, please raise your hand.